Mother called me the night before the reading to say she hoped I'd keep it together. That was how she put it. Keep it together. Like I was the one who needed to be warned. I hadn't slept. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table in my apartment in Columbus since 2 in the morning, going through a folder I'd built over 18 months. Emails, screenshots, a voicemail my uncle left that he probably forgot existed, bank statements with my name on accounts I never opened. My grandmother had died 6 weeks earlier. Quietly, in the way she'd lived. Early morning, her bedroom, the window cracked open the way she liked it, even in November. I was the one who found her. I was the one who'd been driving 40 minutes out to her house every Tuesday and Friday for 3 years, bringing groceries, sitting with her while she watched her shows, helping her remember which pill was which. My mother knew this. My aunt knew this. Everyone knew this. What I didn't know, what none of them told me, was that for the last 8 months of my grandmother's life, my aunt had been visiting her too. Alone. On days I wasn't there. I found that out the same week the lawyer's office called to schedule the reading. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I didn't do any of this for money. I want to be able to say that and have it mean something. My grandmother's house wasn't worth much. The savings she had left weren't what they once were. What mattered to me, what had always mattered, was the writing desk in her bedroom. Dark walnut, brass handles, a hairline crack on the left side from when my grandfather moved it up the stairs 40 years ago. She'd told me I could have it. She'd told me that when I was 19, and again when I was 26, and one more time about 14 months before she died when she was having one of her clear afternoons and we sat together going through old photos. "That desk is yours," she said. "I want you to have it." My aunt apparently had different information. The reading was held at a lawyer's office in a suburb I'd never been to, the kind with a parking lot that's too big for the building and fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they haven't slept. My mother was already there when I arrived. She was wearing the dark blazer she wore to funerals and serious conversations. She hugged me in the way she'd been hugging me for years, arms close to her body, a brief press of her cheek against mine. My aunt was across the room. She had her reading glasses on even though nothing had started yet. My cousin was next door, the one who goes to law school in Boston and likes to remind people of that. They looked like a unit. They'd come together, parked together, were sitting together on the same side of the conference table. I sat on the other side, next to my mother, and I put my bag on the chair next to me because I needed to feel like I was taking up the right amount of space. Here's what I should explain, because otherwise none of what happened will make sense. I am my grandmother's oldest grandchild. I lived with her for a summer when I was 8, when my parents were going through the first of what would become a series of separations. She taught me to make her biscuits. She let me sleep in the big bed. She never once made me feel like a burden during what was, looking back, one of the more destabilizing summers of my childhood. When I moved back to Ohio at 28 after a job in Seattle ended badly, she was the first person to call me and say, "Come stay if you need to." I didn't take her up on it, but I thought about it every single night for a month, and just knowing it was there made it possible to find an apartment and start over. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, had a different relationship with my grandmother. It was loving, I think, in the way that some family relationships are loving without being particularly present. She sent cards, she called on holidays, she visited a few times a year before my grandmother's health started declining and then less. That changed about 8 months before my grandmother died. I started noticing things when I'd arrive on Tuesday mornings and find the kitchen rearranged. A vase moved. The throw blanket on the couch, the green one my grandmother liked, replaced by a different blanket. New things in the fridge that my grandmother wouldn't have bought and that I hadn't brought. Small things, easy to explain away. My grandmother mentioned my aunt was visiting more. I was glad. I told myself I was glad. What I didn't know was that my aunt had also started spending time alone with my grandmother in her bedroom, going through her things. My grandmother's memory had been getting harder to navigate. There were good days and foggy days. On the foggy days, she sometimes got confused about what she'd already given away, what she'd promised, who had been there recently. I didn't know any of this until after. After I found the letter. This is the part I have to explain carefully because I know how it sounds. I wasn't snooping. I was going through my grandmother's bedside drawer the week after she died, looking for a phone number she'd written down for me once. Her pharmacist, a woman named Greta who'd been kind to her and who I wanted to call just to say thank you. The drawer had the usual things: reading glasses, a few coins, a small photograph of my grandfather that I'd seen 100 times, and a note in my grandmother's handwriting that said, "The desk goes to Rennie." Rennie is what my aunt's family calls her. It is not what my grandmother called her. My grandmother called her by her full name, always. She called me by my full name too, except when I was a child and she called me Mija because she'd spent a year in New Mexico in her 20s and some things stick. The handwriting was my grandmother's, but it wasn't her handwriting from the clear afternoons. It was the other kind. Shaky. The letters too large, spaced unevenly, the way her writing looked on the foggy days. I took a photograph of the note. I put it back exactly where I found it. I went home and I sat with what I knew for 2 weeks before I called the lawyer's office to ask a few careful questions. That phone call is where things started to open up in ways I wasn't prepared for. The lawyer, a calm, measured man who spoke like someone who had learned to deliver information without inflection, told me the will had been updated. 4 months before my grandmother died, there had been an amendment. He told me this in the same tone someone might use to tell you your flight has been delayed. I asked who had accompanied my grandmother to sign the amendment. There was a pause. He said my aunt had brought her in. I thanked him. I hung up. I opened the folder on my laptop that I'd been adding to for months. Receipts from my grocery runs, notes I'd made after visits, a few texts my grandmother had sent me on her good days talking about the desk, about the summer I was 8, about wanting me to have something of hers that meant something. I'd never thought of this folder as evidence. I'd just been keeping it the way I kept things, out of habit because I was the kind of person who documented. I added the photograph of the note. I started making calls. The reading lasted 47 minutes. The lawyer went through everything in order: the house, the savings, the small items. When he got to the desk, I watched my aunt's hands. She had them folded on the table. When the lawyer read the amendment, her fingers pressed together a little tighter. The desk was listed as going to her. My mother made a sound next to me, very small. I put my hand on her arm. My cousin from Boston opened his mouth. And I said, quietly, "I'd like a moment before we discuss that, if that's all right." I had asked the lawyer's assistant beforehand if it would be appropriate to raise a concern during the reading if I had documentation. She'd told me to bring everything in writing and to ask to be heard before anything was finalized. I opened my bag. I had a folder, a real one, paper, printed the way my grandmother would have done it. I slid a copy across the table to the lawyer and kept one in front of me. I didn't raise my voice. I had made a decision weeks before that I would not raise my voice. I walked through it, the texts, the grocery records, my grandmother's own words sent to me in a message 11 months before she died. "That old desk has always had your name on it. Don't let anyone tell you different." The dates of my visits, which I'd been noting in a shared calendar with her home aide, a woman who had, when I reached out to her gently 2 weeks prior, confirmed that she remembered my grandmother talking about me in the desk. The aide had written a short statement. It was in the folder. And then the photograph of the note, which I explained, the handwriting, the name, the fact that my grandmother never called her sister Rennie. Not once in the 29 years I'd known her. The room was quiet. My aunt said, "That note is in her handwriting." I said, "Yes, it is, and I've also included a comparison with letters she wrote me during the same period and letters from 2 years before, and I'd invite anyone here to look at the difference." My cousin started to say something about legal standing. The lawyer raised a hand very slightly and my cousin stopped. My aunt looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. I had nothing to prove in this room that I hadn't already put on paper. What happened next was not dramatic in the way I used to imagine these moments would be. Nobody stormed out. Nobody cried. The lawyer said he would need to take this under advisement and that there were next steps that would need to involve additional review. He said it in his careful, uninfluenced way. My aunt gathered her things. She said to no one in particular that she had just been trying to make sure everything was in order. My cousin touched her elbow. They left before I did. My mother sat next to me after they were gone. The lawyer had stepped out to make a call. It was just the two of us at the long table with the fluorescent light making everything look the same color. She said, "How long did you know?" I said, "Long enough." She was quiet. Then she said, "I should have paid more attention." I didn't tell her that she was right, even though she was. It didn't feel like the moment for that. There's a version of this story where I tell you I felt triumphant walking out of that office, where I describe how the cold air hit me and I stood in the too big parking lot and felt the weight lift. That's not exactly what happened. What happened was I sat in my car for about 15 minutes and ate the granola bar I'd put in my bag that morning because I'd been too anxious to eat breakfast and I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I thought about my grandmother on a good afternoon, the light coming through the kitchen window the way it did in winter, her hands around a mug. I thought about the desk, the hairline crack on the left side, the way the brass handles were slightly tarnished in a way she'd never let me fix because she liked it that way. I thought about the folder I'd been building for 18 months without knowing why. Just in case. Just because something in me had understood that love sometimes needs a paper trail. 6 weeks after the reading, the desk was delivered to my apartment by a moving company. I'd chosen the corner of my living room near the east window, because that's where the morning light comes, in the same way it came through her kitchen in winter. I put my grandmother's photograph on top of it, the small one, her and my grandfather, the one from her bedside drawer that I'd asked if I could keep. My aunt and I haven't spoken since the reading. My mother calls every Sunday. She asks about the desk sometimes. I tell her it's good. It's solid. It's exactly where it belongs. I don't know if my aunt thought she was doing something wrong. I spent a lot of time turning that question over and I still don't have a clean answer. What I know is that someone who is confused and losing the sharpness of her days is not the right person to make a decision in a room where only one person is doing the asking. I stayed quiet for years about a lot of things. I drove 40 minutes twice a week and I brought the groceries and I helped with the pills and I sat through the foggy afternoons and the good ones and I did it because I loved her, not because I was keeping score. But I kept the texts, I kept the calendar, I kept the records. Not because I expected this, because when someone matters to you, you pay attention. You notice things. You write them down. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the evidence of love is the most powerful thing you can bring into a room. The desk is sitting by the east window right now. I can see it from where I'm writing this. There's a hairline crack on the left side that I used to think about fixing. I don't think about that anymore. Some things are in their marks. Some things are exactly right because of what they've been through, not in spite of it. I've been asked a few times since all of this happened whether I feel guilty, whether I think I went too far, bringing documentation to a family moment, turning something emotional into something procedural. I understand the question. I used to be the kind of person who would have asked it myself. But here's what I've come to understand. What I brought into that room wasn't strategy. It was just attention. It was 3 years of showing up, of noticing, of caring enough to write things down. The folder existed because my grandmother mattered to me, not because I was preparing for a fight. The difference between those two things is the whole story. My aunt made a choice. I don't know everything that was in her head when she drove my grandmother to that office, when she sat beside her while the amendment was signed. I've stopped trying to know. What I do know is that what she did required my grandmother to be unclear, and it required the rest of us to be absent. It worked in the silence. It only stopped working when someone showed up with proof that they'd been paying attention. That's not luck. That's cause and effect. The outcome of those 2 years of Tuesday and Friday visits wasn't just the desk. It was a record. A real one. The kind that holds up in a fluorescent-lit conference room when someone is trying to rewrite what happened. I think about my grandmother on the good afternoons, how sharp she was, how funny, how certain about the things she cared about. She had a kind of integrity that I always admired without having a word for it when I was young. She didn't perform her values, she just lived by them. Quietly, consistently, in ways that didn't require an audience. That desk was in her bedroom for 40 years. She never once suggested it go anywhere other than where she said it would go. I learned something from being her granddaughter. I learned that doing the right thing, the unglamorous, repetitive, no one is watching version of the right thing, creates a kind of record that nothing can fake. You can't manufacture 3 years of grocery receipts. You can't invent a shared calendar with a homemade. You can't forge the specific tenderness in a text message sent on a good afternoon. And I learned that clarity of mind isn't just intellectual, it's moral. Knowing what you value and staying true to it even when it costs you ease or comfort or the approval of people you love, that's a different kind of intelligence than the kind you can argue in a conference room. My cousin from Boston knows a great deal about legal standing. He doesn't know what it looks like to sit with someone on a foggy afternoon and help her remember which pill is which. There's a version of me that stays quiet. That doesn't build the folder, doesn't ask the careful questions, doesn't bring anything into the room. That version of me loses the desk and calls it keeping the peace. I don't regret not being her. What I brought to that table wasn't aggression, it was the accumulated weight of showing up. And the thing about that kind of weight is that it doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs to be set down in front of the right people at the right moment. The desk is by the east window. The light hits it in the morning the same way it hit her kitchen in winter. That's enough.